All right, Mike, can you hear me? All right, cool. All right, so good evening, everybody, and thank you for tuning in, both in person and online. Welcome to my show, Just a Short Line, the story of the Rahway Valley Railroad, stories and other anecdotes. I gave this presentation to the Union Township Historical Society last year. I didn't do it on a live stream or anything that was recorded, so I figured I'd come back to Tri-State and present it here. So as most of you probably know, my name is Richie King, president of Tri-State Railway Historical Society and historian of the Rahway Valley Railroad. So as it says, this show is a collection of stories and anecdotes. I'll be sharing with you the more amusing side of this little railroad with some laughable anecdotes, harrowing tales, and sardonic letters that I've collected. I hope to get a couple laughs out of you. So who am I and why am I presenting about this railroad? So Richie King, and for the past decade, I can't even believe it myself, I've been researching this little railroad. I grew up in Union, New Jersey, which the Rahway Valley once traveled through. But I grew up after the railroad was abandoned, and I grew up noticing all these abandoned tracks all over my town. And I grew up, as probably most of us did, as a kid who loved trains. And wondered about where are these tracks? Where did they go? What did they do? I came to learn that they belonged to the Rahway Valley Railroad, at least at one time. And as I learned more about the railroad, I couldn't help but become enamored with its quirky charm. All of my research has culminated in 3 published books, 2 of which I have here tonight, if anyone's interested. More than 700 written pages in the publications, another number I can't quite comprehend. And presentations like this one. So I'm always happy to share with everybody what I've been able to find about this neat little railroad. So before we dive into the stories, let me answer the question, what was the Rahway Valley Railroad? The RV, as it was called, was a small railroad, what railroads called a short line. The railroad measured 11.8 miles in length and served the communities of Roselle Park, Kenilworth, Union, Springfield, Summit, and Maplewood from 1897 to 1992. It was originally built to help develop Kenilworth, which was to be a model industrial town called New Orange. Lewis Keller acquired it in 1904 and extended it to serve his Baltusrol Golf Club in Springfield. Despite those 2 impetuses for its construction, it really came to attract and serve many small industries that once called Union County home. It also hauled much of the materials used to construct the homes, schools, and businesses in this area. It really was a catalyst for development in Union County. But all of that is not really why we're here today. We're here to answer the question, what makes this railroad so darned amusing? Big railroads also come across as monoliths, mundane and unassuming, hauling freight and passengers along its tracks, almost faceless and nameless in their operations, especially today. Because it was small, people were able to get closer to the Rahway Valley than the big railroads. Rail fans were constantly snapping pictures of its unpretentious operations. Local residents could pick out which locomotive was running that day. There were only 3, just by the sound of its whistle. Or write direct letters to the railroad's president when black cinders from one of their steam locomotives showered their clothesline. Kids were always hanging around and snagging rides from the railroad's only train crew. The train crew, which only numbered a handful of men, were larger-than-life characters on this little itty-bitty railroad. Their personalities made the railroad more than it was. All of this conspired to give the railroad a personality which comes through in the amusing tales I'll share with you tonight. So the Rahway Valley was tiny, only 11.8 miles long. Its main line traveled through Roselle Park, Kenilworth, where it had its offices and shops, Union, Springfield, and Summit. There were 3 branch lines. There was the Lehigh Valley branch that connected down to Lehigh Valley Railroad. There was the Rahway River branch, which was only a mile long, went through the heart of Kenilworth, down to the industry that was at the time at the end of the branch on the Rahway River. And then there was the Newark Heights branch, which was the longest at 3 miles, that went into Maplewood. The railroad had connections with 3 neighboring railroads, the C&J, the Lehigh Valley Railroad, and the Lackawanna Railroad up in Summit. The head of this little system for many years was this man, George Arthur Clark. He served as president and general manager from 1932 until his death in 1969. Clark called the RV a one-horse railroad, as he said its output couldn't support many horses. And he served as titular head of every department that needed one. The railroad's personality centered on him. He was a big, awkward, and disheveled man, reflexively profane and ribaldry humorous. His unique brand of personality and ability to turn a phrase is what endeared the railroad to many. Clark had a well-trained, highly cohesive group of railroaders working with him. He once said, "We've got 21 here, including me. 1 train crew, engineer, fireman, conductor, and 2 brakemen, a section crew of 6, 3 agents, 2 men in the shop, and the rest of us here in the office." There was a close camaraderie on the RV. It could be sensed. It could be felt in Clark's telling of the fun we have here. It could be proved by the way the tiny railroad overcame every obstacle. Frank Frote was the engineer from 1939 to 1971. He had intermittently worked for the RV earlier than that, working as a fireman in 1920 and as a hostler in 1932. He was raised in Rahway and later lived in Cranford and Garwood. Frote was an untidy man, often wearing the same dirt, grease, and sludge that also adorned the locomotives. The unkempt Frote would not be allowed in the caboose at lunch. Unable to afford new work clothes, he would change out his coveralls once a year. Clark, who would nickname all the employees, called him Dirty Nick, would buy Frote a new set of coveralls each Christmas. He was dedicated to the Rahway Valley and rarely ever took a day off. When his mother died in 1951, he only took off half a day to attend the funeral. Harry Williamson Jr. was hired by the RV in 1928 at age 19 as a brakeman, but was really an expert at most anything. He later served as fireman and relief conductor. Clark had promised him the engineer seat when Pop Snyder retired, but gave it to Frote instead. Williamson became the conductor in 34 and left the railroad in 43 to go firing for the C&J. George Red Davis, with the RV since 1927, became conductor after Williamson quit. Davis was a hyper individual, always moving fast, possessed little patience, and did everything in a hurry. Davis was an expert in all operating areas. Clark depended on him heavily, and he could fill in most any position. With just blocking and jacks, Davis could rectify most any derailment. Frote's first fireman in his many years of the railroad was Tom Mangini, whom the rest of the crew, perhaps somewhat ironically or sarcastically, called Happy. He became a brakeman in 1942, but soon after got his thumb smashed in a coupler and spent some time convalescing. On the RV, he begged Frote for a crack to the throttle, would fight with Davis, and used to blunder all the time. Unmindful of his own Italian ancestry, Mangini berated the section men and insolently addressed them as wops. The RV didn't pay overtime, and Mangini impudently pestered Clark over the matter. He quit the RV in 1944 during the war, declaring that Clark would either fire him or get him drafted into the military. But he returned after the war ended in 1946. Frank Amoroso had taken over as the fireman after Mangini quit, and the husband of Clark's secretary, Lillian, Alan Rambo, quit. Rambo received 6 months of experience with the Rahway Valley before going over to the Erie Railroad, infuriating George Clark. In August 1950, Clark had hired his very own son-in-law, Joe Marzak, as fireman. Marzak was a bodybuilder type, and Clark had thought he'd be well suited to the physical work of a locomotive fireman. Evidently, the dirty work wasn't well suited to his good looks, and he quit, incensing Clark. A short while later, Clark hired Bobby Heft, and told him, "Come in Monday, ready to work. If you only work 2 days and quit, I'll kick you in the ass." Heft had served in the Air Force, attended the Juilliard School of Music, but achieved his lifelong ambition of working for a railroad when Clark hired him. For his musical background and proclivity to talking, Clark referred to him as the human phonograph in notices posted in the shop bulletin board. The Rahway Valley was constantly shorthanded in all operating departments and went through brakemen like paper towels. Any employee who could get fellows to work 10 days and could expect to earn a $10 bounty from George Clark. The head brakeman for several years was John Enright. He had come from the Rahway Valley after being booted from the C&J for violating Rule G, drinking on the job. Despite this, Enright was a reliable hard worker. George Davis's younger brother, Bob Davis, was hired as brakeman in 1944 and was promoted to conductor in 1946. Unlike his elder brother, Davis consistently gave Clark grief over the lousy working conditions, was impossible to work with, fought with everyone, and would always pester the train crew about their love lives. At a stop, while the rest of the crew was drilled freight cars, Davis would be in the customer offices, either flirting with the secretaries or shooting the breeze with the consignees instead of helping the train crew. The railroad had a single section crew to care for the maintenance of the tracks, bridges, and road crossings. Back in those days, the section men were nearly exclusively Italian immigrants who spoke but broken English. They were under the charge of Augustine Shorty Marciano, the section foreman, who later retired and was replaced by Frank Amoroso. Amoroso would usually work as a fireman on the steam locomotive when one of the regular firemen would quit. When the railroad ran steam engines, they'd have to be kept under steam around the clock, as you can't simply turn a key to fire them up. So the railroad had a night watchman, George Old Pocono Kimball, to tend to the fire 6 nights a week. Two of the sectionmen, Pete Mascaro and Tony Scaramuzzino, would alternate on Sundays when the railroad didn't run. They spoke broken English but were genial and would move the engines around for rail fans who wanted to take pictures. Another sectionman, Tony Romeo, took over for Old Pocono when he quit to go fire a movie theater furnace. The section men were also responsible for calling up the locomotives each morning. One morning in August 1945, Tony Romeo struck out for home after spotting engine number 15 on the coaling track and shutting off her air pumps off. He left her air reverse forward too. Frank Amoroso with the section men were busy coaling number 15 up that morning when the engine began to roll. She went right off the unblocked end of the track and sunk her pony wheels and forward drivers in the mud before anyone could do anything to stop her. Tony had blocked her with only a tiny block of wood and had put it under a tender wheel at that. Amoroso went running to Carl Neese, the master mechanic, yelling, "I no do it, I no do it." Another engine had to be fired up to pull number 15 out of the mud hours later. The man with the most seniority on the railroad was Carl Neese. He had hired out on the RV in 1910 as a brakeman and originally hailed from Virginia. He had a 2-year stint on the C&J from 1913 to 1915 and returned to the Rahway Valley as a fireman, was later promoted to engineer, and finally promoted to shop foreman in 1922. And finally, Clark bestowed upon him the title of superintendent. Neese had charge over keeping the railroad's 3 steam locomotives in good repairs, with only the Rahway Valley's primitive facilities at his disposal. He was a Southerner by birth from Charlottesville, Virginia. The train crew called him Master Maniac or Cadillac for his taste in automobiles. During the summer months, he was often joined in the shop by his son, John Sharon Neese, who enjoyed helping his dad. As a kid, to his dismay, everyone called him Sharon, but Clark called him Poop Deck. One day in the summer of 43, part of the American concrete pipe plant on the Nork Heights branch on Stanley Terrace in Union burned down. Carl Neese raced one of the railroad's motor cars to Branch Junction in Union to head up there quick and get some cars out of the place before they burned up. The American concrete people had called Kenilworth. Neese went around the curves above Kenilworth and nothing flat, warning his kid, Sharon, who was with him, to be ready to bail out if they hit anything or even met the train. They didn't, and they were able to warn the crew. The train crew got up there in time, just in time to get the cars out. Kids were constantly hanging around the railroad. They were often attracted there by Sharon Neese and given the run of the place. The train crew was always happy to oblige and give the kids rides in the locomotives. They would treat the locomotives and train cars parked at Kenilworth as their jungle gyms. They would walk the tracks, constantly took pictures, and would pester the employees with questions. One employee likened one of the kids to being part of the FBI for all the impudent questions. The photo on the right shows a young Norm Kelting and Sharon Neese posing on their usual plaything, the big derelict steam locomotive number 12, stored in Kenilworth. Kelting sticks his tongue out to the photographer, Bill Young. On the back of the photograph, Young called Kelting Blimpo and wrote that his ambition was to become a locomotive. In October of 43, a 15-year-old Bill Young and his friends, John Arneson and Nancy Comezzo, were cycling around Surprise Lake in Mountainside and headed for home through Summit. They encountered the train crew at Marseille, so they climbed up the embankment and found them trying to re-rail a car on the Hill City spur in Summit. The section men were there, helping the train crew with the re-rail frogs. The train finally got in order and slipped down the mountain back towards Kenilworth. The three kids then piled their bikes onto the motor car and rode with them all the way to the Route 29 crossing, now called Route 22. So Clark wouldn't see them when they pulled into Kenilworth, and they followed the motor car along North Michigan Avenue back to the yard in Kenilworth. Bill Young was a neighbor and friend of Sharon Neese, which is how he got interested in the Rahway Valley, and they both lived in Cranford. Young used to come to Kenilworth on Sundays, the only day the railroad didn't operate, and take out George Clark's velocipede, pictured here, with the permission of one of the Sunday hostlers. This was only after Carl Neese had gone home. During the war, Neese used to come up to Kenilworth every Sunday, putter around, work his big victory garden, and feed his chickens. At some point, someone spotted Young, and Clark got wind that someone had been riding his velocipede. After that, Young's two Italian hostler friends were afraid to let him take it out. The Rahway Valley had a great deal of trouble with children playing pranks, throwing switches, placing things on the tracks, and stealing. One kid, Carl Conover, lived alongside the tracks in this house seen behind the locomotive at 701 Liberty Avenue in Union, New Jersey. He would meet the train at the crossing and ride with the crew and flag the crossings for them as they worked their way up to Summit. Clark had occasion to write Conover's father, John, saying his kid was cutting air hoses, uncoupling freight cars, winding on handbrakes, and throwing switches. The railroad had never previously complained, but one day Carl, the local Stevens boys, and some other young lad removed a pair of push car wheels, complete with axle and bearings, from the yard at Kenilworth. Clark threatened to turn the matter over to the Union Police Department if they weren't returned within 24 hours. And that's Carl Conover riding on the pilot of number 13 over the Rahway River Bridge. A short time later, local police put a quick end to the careers of the four budding railroad barons. The youths, ranging in age from 10 to 12 years old, had built their own pushcar to carry them to their favorite swimming hole in the Rahway River. They were spotted by William Sweetland, manager of the Battle Hill Golf Club, who called the police. Patrolmen Henry Kitchell and Edward Brush overtook the four railroad men, took them home, and had them dismantle the pushcar under their supervision. Kids weren't the only cause of the railroad's problems. The area served by the railroad became increasingly suburbanized as the years wore on. With the increase in population came more and more grade crossing accidents. Carl Neese loved to tell about the time three men got themselves inebriated at Hess's Tavern in Cranford, and then proceeded to get in a big open touring car and proclaimed their intention of going to Newark. Someone said ominously at the bar, "They'll never get there," and they didn't. When they got to Kenilworth, they rolled down the boulevard. They rolled down the boulevard just in time to get hit by a Rahway Valley train. The car rolled over 2 or 3 times and landed upside down. Neese and the others surely thought the men inside the car were dead. As they lifted the car up, they crawled out. Not the least bit hurt and as stewed as ever. I guess their buzz wore off. 2 months later, the owner of the car, who had been riding in the back seat at the time of the wreck, tried to sue the Rahway Valley for damages to his car. Another time, the boys hit a car at Fatute Avenue in Kenilworth. The Kenilworth police chief came down to investigate. He looked at the plates and said to Neese, "My gosh, Carl, this car is stolen." The man driving it soon stopped, raising the roof about his car being wrecked. Crossing accidents weren't the only dust-ups. Engine number 14 figured in a serious smash about Christmas time 1940. The caboose, number 102, the Rahway Valley's one and only, was ahead of the engine. A boxcar was behind it. The train crew was going to use a flying switch to get the boxcar into a siding where some other cars were sitting. For those that don't know, a flying switch is where the locomotive pulls the car forward and the crew pulls the pin on the couplers on the fly. The locomotive goes past the switch, and then the crew quickly throws the switch, and then the freight car, still rolling, goes into the siding. Train crews did this when cars were on the wrong end of the engine to put them into a siding. This was a somewhat unsafe but very common practice on the Rahway Valley that only had one runaround. So it was dark, between 7 and 8 p.m. The engine started up quickly, but the switch to the siding was thrown open instead of being closed. For the man at it, Tom Mangini, thought it was improperly set. The engine went tearing down into the siding, caboose ahead. The caboose socked into the cars already there and leapt onto number 14's pilot, smashing the engine smoke box braces and headlight. The caboose's woodwork was tumbled like a deck of cards, and one truck was completely shorn off. Meanwhile, the boxcar, uncoupled, started on the other track and smashed into 14's tender, gashing it. Carl Neese, all dressed up in evening clothes and just about ready to leave the house for a party, had to rush back upstairs and change to his working togs when he received the call to come. 4 minutes after the phone had rung, he was out of the house and off the scene at Branch Junction in Union, without a word of explanation to his wife. A brakeman had run and walked to Kenilworth all the way from Union, where the old watchman, George Kimball, called up George Clark. Clark thereupon called Neese. It was quite a job in the dark to get the caboose off of number 14 and all back to the shop. Then there's the story of the lazy conductor, our friend Bob Davis. One of his coworkers referred to him as a pain in the ass and a lazy son of a gun. Davis would only make a few air hose connections on which activated the brakes on train cars on a 10 or 12 car train. One day, the RV picked up about a half dozen cars in Summit at the top of the grade. Davis only connected 3 or 4 cars of air to save time and waved the train off down the hill, the 4% grade, back down to Springfield. Then, on the steep downgrade, Frote had trouble controlling the train with only a few air brakes. When trying to stop for Mountain Avenue in Springfield, pictured here, to flag the crossing, there wasn't enough air to stop. The train slid through the crossing with the engine brakes locked. After running through the crossing, the train crew switched some cars in Springfield. The train picked up some cars left on the passing track, which had been shoved in from the east, adding cars from the west end to go back to Aldine. Bob Davis never walked back to check if all the cars had coupled, and of course, did not connect any of the air hoses. After departing, they inadvertently left most of their train on the passing track. The last hitch he made did not make. When Davis left, he had part of his train behind him at Springfield. They didn't have the whole train. When they got to Aldine and went to set out for the CNJ, Conductor Davis discovered the fact that he was missing a lot of his cars. The crew figured that the only place they could be was at Springfield. It was getting late and already getting dark, so they ran fast to make up time. They went flying. They raced through Kenilworth and went back to Springfield. George Clark had gone back to the office that night to do some work. So Clark was in the office and saw the train fly on by. So the next day, the notice was on the wall from George Clark saying that we are not running the Broadway Limited. Whenever there was some mishap, George Clark would never miss an opportunity to admonish the crew in writing in official notices posted to the bulletin board in the shop. In this notice, Clark seeks out the culprits stealing all the railroad's light bulbs out of their sockets and replacing them with burnt out ones, declaring, "Why go to all this trouble and why cause so much trouble when we will gladly donate your requirements of new bulbs from stock?" Pilferage on the railroad always seemed to be a problem. In another notice, he declared his intention to put a stop to this pilferage problem, as he felt one morning they'd come in to find the whole railroad missing. Clark sometimes had good reason to admonish the crew. Sometimes they could get a little bit careless. The railroad had several side tracks that went inside customer buildings, including Elastic Stopnut and Union. The conductor was supposed to tell the firemen when they were about to drill cars at Stopnut, as to not cause the locomotive to belch too much black smoke. Well, one day they went to drill Stopnut, and the conductor, our friend Bob Davis, hadn't told the fireman, Bob Heft. Heft had just loaded the firebox full of coal, and clouds of black smoke were billowing from the stack. Later on, the crew found out that the Stopnut shop foreman had called George Clark at the office in Kenilworth, complaining that the train crew had drove his men out of the building from all of the black smoke. Another time, along the top of the Y at Branch Junction, just north of Route 22, the crew was flying cars into Carpenter Steel. They stopped too hard and derailed the locomotive. The cinders from the firebox shook loose and set the grass on fire. The RV had but one water tank on its railroad to fill the cisterns of its steam locomotive tenders, and it was in Kenilworth. After working the stiff grade to Summit, the locomotive sometimes would be in need of water. The train crew would frequently take water in Summit on the Lackawanna. They had, even though no one was qualified in Lackawanna territory, they had to go through the interlocking in Summit to get to the water plug on the Gladstone side of the station. Nobody on the RV crew was qualified, but the tower operator would hold for them anyway. Froat would blow 2 toots on the whistle and would get clearance through the station from the tower operator. The Lackawanna would bill the Rahway Valley $1 for the water. George Clark would scream like hell at the crew and he would get the bill. Froat would blame Heft for wasting water and letting the engine pop off. Clark got grief elsewhere too. Housewives along the railroad's right-of-way did not appreciate the Rahway Valley showering their clean clotheslines strung out to dry with cinders and black coal smoke. On one particular occasion in April of 41, a few stray sparks from a passing Rahway Valley steam locomotive set fire to the entire clothesline behind the house at 39 Ashwood Avenue, which is still there today, in Summit. Incensed over the loss, Mrs. Rose Formicella wrote to Clark, itemizing each and every one of the clothes that she had lost. and demanded that the railroad make good on the fire. Clark refused to admit liability, but resolved to close out the matter. When Mrs. Formicella requested the RV pay for brand new garments to replace the ones that were destroyed, Clark dickered over the price and said the ones that were burned were probably used, and offered $25 to settle the issue. Clark possessed a uniquely vigorous, sardonic, larger-than-life personality. He was an outspoken man who said what he thought. He was something of an icon in the realm of long-winded satirical correspondence, at least among those chums on the receiving end of his epistles. For years, the Rahway Valley was a member of the Kenilworth Manufacturers Association, but as evidenced by this letter, Clark was a reluctant participant. Instead of mailing me out notices of each regular meeting of the Kenilworth Manufacturers Association, which we use for toilet tissue due to its non-finger breakthrough texture, why in hell don't you save the treasury by eliminating this cookie from your mailing list, as very frankly, your homely puss turns my stomach. Clark could also become genuinely derisive if he felt the railroad was being mistreated. In the 50s, the railroad was having a great deal of trouble with flooding being caused by a clogged drainage ditch at the Beth David Cemetery in Kenilworth. After having his cries for help falling on deaf ears with both Union County and the borough of Kenilworth, the mayor included, Clark penned this letter of this creation to the mayor of the town. After this letter, he was finally met with action on the issue. We called your attention to the flooded condition of our property, occasioned by the Beth David Cemetery filling up the drainage ditch. After each storm, the resulting surface water which backs up on our property could very easily float the Queen Mary. So perhaps it would be advisable for us to charter the old Sandy Hook steamer and operating sightseeing cruises around the thriving metropolis of Kenilworth, New Jersey. On January 29th, 1951, the Rahway Valley took delivery of its first diesel-electric locomotive, number 16. George Clark did not put it in service right away, as he and George Davis, who had recently been promoted to shop foreman, wanted to play with it and learn its idiosyncrasies around Kenilworth before putting it on the road. When the locomotive was delivered, Clark strutted about like a turkey and was like a kid with a new toy. The brand new engine house behind it, he admonished the crew and told them not to bring in their dirty boots. The next day after the diesel was delivered on Tuesday, January 30th, 51, the RV crew was working with number 15 and was returning from the Lehigh Valley interchange in Roselle Park. Approaching West Webster Avenue, Froat brought the train to a stop to allow the brakeman, Jack Jenkins, a Kentuckian with a deep southern drawl, to flag the crossing. A tree surgeon's truck had stopped at the crossing as well. Then, after giving a couple blasts of the whistle, 15 began to get underway again. Simultaneously, the truck, misreading the signal, headed for the crossing. The truck and the locomotive had a slow motion collision. George Clark came down to look over the mess, but the matter was soon cleared up. The railroad eventually paid the Corson brothers $86 to clear up the issue. Three days later, on Friday, February 1st, 1951, Clark threw a party at Kenilworth to celebrate the arrival of the new diesel. He invited officials from the nearby Morristown and Erie to imbibe at the new engine house with the new red diesel. But Clark couldn't catch a break, as that same day, number 15 derailed in the middle of the eastbound lanes of Route 29, now called Route 22, with 16 cars behind him. The diesel had to be ordered out to pull the cars off of number 15 and help with the re-railing. The derailment was blamed on ice buildup in the flangeway. Bob Heth, the fireman, said the traffic was backed up all the way to Somerville. A week later, there were still cases of beer, several cases of them in fact, and a few bottles of the more potent stuff still piled up in the engine house from the celebration with the M&E folks. Well, one day before they intended, they had to put number 16 in service. About 10:30 a.m. on February 26, 1951, The crew was pulling a good-sized train with number 13 west on the main line, paralleling Market Street in Kenilworth. Alongside the track was lock joint pipe, which used a crane to move concrete pipes that they manufactured. Suddenly, the crane swung 180 degrees with a swinging pipe that was going to hit the locomotive. Bob Hefts saw it coming and pulled the emergency brake. The pipe proceeded to smash the headlight, broke the bell harp from the locomotive, which, with the bell, fell to the walkway on the engineer's side. Continuing, the pipe hit the steam dome, gave the steam dome a glancing blow, which caused a deafening roar of escaping steam. Bouncing upward, and when the train stopped, the pipe was resting on the caboose roof and put a big gash in it. The crew still had a day's work ahead of them, so they started the diesel and went back to their train. Frote had never run a diesel before, so George Davis stayed with the crew the rest of the day. They were now running quite late, and about 9:30 p.m., they were shaking out their C&J and Lehigh Valley deliveries, which required them to cross and recross West Colfax Ave in Roselle Park many times. Frote would blow the horn the customary 2 long, 1 short, 1 long every time they crossed West Colfax. It was deafening. When they finally wound up at the office around 11 p.m., Clark came out and said his phone had been burning up for hours, with people complaining about the horn. He said one guy who lives in the Colfax Garden Apartments threatened to shove the horn up Frote's posterior orifice. A second diesel, number 17, was acquired in 54. The RV settled into its diesel years, but the antics continued. One of the brakemen in the 60s was George Matz. Skip that. He had been furloughed from the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad and hired out on the RV. He was a firebug. The crew would spend a lot of time switching at Branch Junction at the Essex chair switch. During the cold months, he'd build a fire there to keep warm while they were switching. The crew would get a bunch of stuff, pile it up, light it up, and keep their hands warm for a few minutes. That became a habit, more or less, until Carpenter Steele complained that the train crew was leaving unattended fires. Once, a hopper car was left on the Y-leg near Industrial Plywood. The manager at Industrial asked the train crew if he could throw some scraps of wood into the hopper to clean up around the warehouse. The train crew said, "Yeah, go ahead." When they came back to pick up the car to drop off at Summit, they looked in the car and discovered it was about a third full of 2x4s and old plywood. Matt suggested the crew burn the wood as they don't expect so much in the car. Matt lit the wood and figured they'd let it burn on the way to Summit to get rid of it. The car started to smoke heavily, and soon flames were licking over the car top. The train crew casually shoved the car into the yard in Summit and went to the tower to hand in their way bills like nothing was the matter. On the way back down the hill, they heard sirens from fire trucks. Yet another time, an empty flat car from Boychuk Stone was picked up from the Springfield team track. It had wood stakes in its pockets, padded with an Excelsior wrapping, and was coupled to the hind end of the train. Max lit the Excelsior with a lighter while riding the car and was whooping it up. As it burned, looking back down the hill, the train crew noticed fires breaking out in the brush along the tracks as the Excelsior dropped off. George Clark reamed out the crew. Max's excuse was, "Must have been a stuck brake." The whole spectacle tickled Frank Frote. From 1966 and 1967, the conductor of the Rahway Valley was 20-year-old Walt Switz. Switz recalled that one time they picked up a Pennsylvania Railroad 40-foot boxcar for Volco Brass in Kenilworth, a load of scrap copper from the Erie-Lackawanna at Summit. After getting their bills, they headed down and were passing through Kenilworth. George Clark came out of the office to meet the crew. He said, "I'm glad you made it. I thought I'd get a call from the police saying you guys were dead in the street and that the Broad Street Bridge had collapsed." The Erie Lackawanna had listed the wrong weight for the car on the bill, 10 tons over, which was overweight for the Broad Street Bridge. Switz said it creaked a little bit, come to think of it. Froat was still the engineer when Switz worked at the RV. Froat was about 68 by this time. One time at Hamilton Union, they were going to pull an empty car out of the siding. The crew unlocked the gate and wound off the handbrake. They gave a signal back to Froat, but there was no response. Upon looking, Frank was asleep on the armrest. "Wake up, Frank," they shouted. He woke up and gave a little smile and a laugh. Another time, one balmy afternoon, all three of the train crew were riding the front platform of the engine, enjoying the breeze, on their way to pull an outbound car from Stopnut. Suddenly, they stopped, well before the switch. The brakeman turned around and said, "I don't see Froat." Switz hustled back to the cab, opened the door, and saw Frank on his knees, by his seat, wiping the floor with some rags. After assuring the crew he was okay, he told the crew he was getting a piece of pie out of his lunchbox and sat it on the control stand just as the engine hit a low joint. Naturally, it slid off and landed upside down. Frank tenderly picked up the remains of the pie and pitched it out the window, no doubt cursing the pie gods for their cruelty. He just wasn't himself the rest of the day. Switz thinks lemon meringue was his favorite. While Switz was working at the RV, a couple of times they received a big cut of empty tank cars at the Erie Lackawanna in Summit that had been moved down from the E.F. Drew chemical plant in Boonton. They were handed off to the RV to bring down to the Lehigh Valley and Roselle Park. The Rahway Valley didn't get any revenue out of the move because they were moving empty. At that time, the railroad had to pay a certain number of cents per car per mile as a rebate for the benefit of having handled the load. However, in the case of the Drew cars, the Rahway Valley had to pay the mileage but got no revenue because they were empty cars. George Clark was really pissed about that. When Clark was doing the stamping for the interchange at the Kenilworth office, marking the date and time handled, he almost broke the stamp, slamming it down so hard on the desk while cursing all the while. Railroad dogs were always plentiful in the Rahway Valley. The progenitor of all those pups was probably Lady, a gaunt black and white hound. She belonged to nobody, begged from the crew when they broke for lunch, hunted rabbits, was filthy, had bad eyes, bore 2 litters, and was quite the character. She wandered a lot and finally disappeared one day. She used to run out onto the greens at Galloping Hill Golf Course next to the Kenilworth office, steal balls from the golfer and run away with them. One day, the Union County Police came to the Kenilworth office to get her. They tied a rope around her neck and took her away in a car. The next day, she was back. The dogs usually outnumber the employees at the railroad and made for a good security system, though the section men who had to shovel the dog poop out of the inspection pit in the engine house each morning may have disagreed. Dogs could usually be found outside in their enclosed pen alongside the station. Only dogs that Clark favored were allowed out inside his office, one of which was a dog named Klondike, which Clark had nicknamed Hot Nuts for always humping the other dogs. Harry Davis took over as superintendent and section foreman after his elder brother, George Davis, had retired. He was kind of a funny guy and was with the railroad for years. All the track work the Rahway Valley did was usually manual, but if they had large sections of tracks to do, Harry would get the John Deere backhoe out. He would then use the backhoe and just rip through the ties, basically just digging a big hole. His older brother, George, would still come around and say, "Harry, just pick out the ties so we don't have to tamp forever. You're creating more work." And the siblings would quarrel. But Harry on that backhoe was like a kid on a Tonka toy. He was in the zone and no one could say anything to him. The rest of the crew would just clear out of the area. Harry would be taking out trees and just making a mess of everything. Meanwhile, George is yelling at him to stop, but he's just digging holes and ripping things up. Not to mention, Harry was nearly blind. He had these bifocals that were always crusted over with dirt too. They would never be clean, and you could barely see his eyes through them. There were a lot of hornets and wasps that would nest in the ties, which was a real problem sometimes for the sectionmen. One time, Joe Ferry and Glenn Marsa were out gauging the tracks and found an area that needed tie replacements, new rails, and so on. They saw that there were hornets coming out of the tracks. Harry needed to burn off the bolts so they could replace the rails and connectors. They said, "Harry, don't go down there, man," he said to them. The bees don't bite this time of year. Don't worry about it." Joe and Glenn just shook their heads. Harry got down there with an acetylene torch and he starts getting his big glasses down there and he's just torching away. Next thing Joe and Glenn know, they see Harry running down the tracks with his shirt up, patting away at his stomach, his eyes bugging out of his head. His whole stomach had welts. He got stung all over. Joe and Glenn were just cracking up because he said the bees don't bite this time of year. Joe Ferry recalled that they'd have to go out and repair the potholes at the grade crossings. One time, him and Harry Davis brought up some asphalt and were repairing the potholes on Route 22 westbound, shown here. They closed a lane of traffic and then had to switch to the other one to finish up. The traffic was backed up as far as you could see. Finally, a Union cop put his lights on and came flying up the shoulder. He got in his car all flustered and started yelling, "You guys got this backed up all the way to Newark. What traffic school did you go to?" The track guys just shrugged their shoulders and said, "We never went to any traffic school." And that's the story. So thank you for listening in. I hope you enjoyed the all the stories that I was able to collect over the years. I'm happy to take any questions. I have a few copies of my book here if anyone's interested in. I also have a couple photo albums of Rahway Valley photos that I've collected, both steam and diesel. And I also have a ledger from all the cars that were interchanged with the C&J in '74. So if anyone's interested in that, you're more than welcome to check it out. But does anyone have any questions? Yes, Mike.
Did you ever interview any of the shippers, and who was the last shipper on the Rahway Valley?
I did interview two of them. I interviewed Norm Woolley from Woolley Coal, who remembered George Clark in his crazy letters. I also interviewed Lowell Jaeger from Jaeger Lumber, and he remembered when they would unload his first job working at his dad's lumber yard was unloading boxcars of lumber at Jaeger Lumber on Morris Ave. And the last shipper was Christie Enterprises in Springfield, or in Kenilworth, that unloaded hopper cars of plastic. Any questions? Yes.
Did the steam end in the '50s?
Steam, so the diesel came in '51, the steam last ran in '53.
Okay.
And then
How many steamers did the Rahway Valley have?
they had a total of 15,
15.
and the last one, number 15, is in Steamtown.
How about on the Summit you showed? Which line is that on Summit, the electrified line? Is that on the Gladstone or Dover? No,
That's the Morrison Essex division.
That's what I was just curious. Thank you.
No problem, which is the same division that's right down the hill.
How much for your books?
Volume 1 is 60, and the volume 3, which is the how-to guide to how to rebuild the railroad, at 400 pages, is 90. Yes, Dan.
Time I stood in Rahway Valley from Lackawanna and you, a terrible snowy day, and the train, the Rahway Valley train was on the wall track, but there were two engines. Did the engines send you?
They did not. So I have some letters with GE where Clark was getting quotes when they're buying 17 to get it MU equipped and get 16 retrofitted with MU, but for whatever reason, they never spent the money. So anytime they had a big train or anything like that, I had to run both of them together. They needed 2 engineers.
On the subject of making money, how did this comedy of errors railroad make money, or did they?
They made quite a bit of money. So their only profitable years, like the first 40 or the first 20, were in like 1904, and then a year during World War I. They were really down on their luck during the 20s. And they started making money just before the Depression. Depression came, lost money again. And then through, pure grit and tenacity, they started turning a profit right in the middle of the Depression. Made a profit every year from 36 to 72. 72 was a deficit year. And then they kept making money basically up until the end. Any other questions?
When did the last train run on the Maplewood branch?
Well, the rails were pulled up out of Maplewood in 73. I believe the last train had run up to Maplewood in 69. But a stub of the Maplewood branch still ran up to Jaeger Lumber till 91. Any other questions? Cool, thank you. Hope you guys enjoyed it. So next month will be Steve Barry, featuring his railroad night photography. So we're looking forward to that. Steve has been a great friend to Tri-State over the years, given a number of presentations, so we're happy to have him back. The month after that will be the O&W presentation. Second Thursdays of the month, same time, same channel. All right, good night, everybody.